Henry's marriage with Catherine runs into a big problem because Catherine does not produce Henry with a living son. She has a number of children with Henry, but only one of those children survives, and that one child who survives is a girl. Her name is Mary. Now, the real problem here comes in with the fact that Catherine has not produced Henry with a boy. She hasn't given him a male heir. And Henry is getting really, really nervous about this because Henry is concerned with this whole idea of primogeniture and the fact that having a son indicates the fact that God loves his country. Not having a son means that God has not blessed his country, and Henry has an entire laundry list of issues and problems with that. Henry starts worrying because Catherine has not produced a son. So Henry begins looking for a reason. What did he do wrong? What did he do to make God mad? Why has God not blessed him with an heir to his kingdom? And Henry finds an answer. Now, better get ready because this is about to turn into a soap opera. It turns out that Catherine was actually engaged to marry Henry's older brother. In fact, they did marry. Catherine actually married Henry's older brother. But Henry's older brother was extremely ill when they married. He was basically on his deathbed. And Catherine and Henry's elder brother never consummated their marriage, all right? So according to church law, because they never had sex, the marriage didn't count. It was never consummated, so it was never blessed by God. So even though they went through the legal marriage ceremony, the marriage was never consummated, so Catherine was still a single woman. When Henry's older brother dies and Henry is crowned king, Catherine has a contract to marry the King of England. Since Henry is crowned king in place of his older brother, Catherine is then married to Henry, and their marriage is consummated, so their marriage counts. Their marriage is blessed. Henry does a lot of praying, a lot of soul searching, a lot of reading of different books, and he comes to the final conclusion that the reason that Catherine has not presented him with a son is because he has sinned by marrying his brother's wife. Henry goes to the Pope and he requests an annulment from Catherine. He does not want a divorce, for the record. Now, I'm assuming you guys know the difference between an annulment and a divorce, all right? An annulment means that the marriage never happened. It was never blessed by God. A divorce means that the marriage happened and it didn't work out. Henry views a divorce as a sin. He doesn't want to be divorced. He wants an annulment. He wants the Pope to say his marriage to Catherine never happened. Now the problem is that Catherine happens to be related to Charles V. Remember him? Holy Roman Emperor, owns like over half the world. That guy. And Catherine and Charles both tell the Pope he better not give Henry an annulment. If Henry gets an annulment, that means that Catherine and Henry's marriage never happened. Catherine's children by Henry are not legitimate. Marriage never happened. Henry was just having an affair. They're illegitimate. And that also makes Catherine a slut who is not eligible for marriage anymore because she's been having an affair with the King of England for umpteen years. The Pope refuses to give Henry an annulment. Henry is sure that he's never going to have a son with Catherine. In fact, he won't even sleep with Catherine anymore because he believes it's a sin because he's sleeping with his brother's wife. Instead, Henry scores himself a mistress. Now, the thing about Henry, his mistress, is a beautiful young Protestant woman named Catherine Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, I beg your pardon. With Anne Boleyn, Henry thinks he's found the right woman for himself. The problem is that Anne happens to come from a Protestant family, and she will not have sex with Henry. That's my dog Sheila, if you heard that. Now, the reason that Catherine will not have sex with Henry is because of her moral values. There's also an argument that she wouldn't because of political reasons. But regardless, Henry desperately wants that annulment from Catherine so he can marry Anne. Ultimately, it gets worse because it turns out that Anne is pregnant. She finally has sex with Henry and she's pregnant. Henry is sure that Anne is carrying his son, and he is desperate to have an annulment from Catherine in order to marry Anne. Henry writes repeatedly to the Pope begging for an annulment. And this struggle to get that annulment becomes known as the Great Matter. Henry's great desire to receive an annulment, his belief that marrying his brother's wife was a sin, and his desperate desire to marry his now pregnant mistress. Henry's great matter is finally resolved by a suggestion from Anne Boleyn, his mistress. Anne is a Protestant, and of course Protestants view things differently than the Catholics. The Protestants do not acknowledge the power of the Pope, not only over the church, but ultimately over kings and princes. Anne says, well, you know, in the Protestant faith, well, the king actually gets a great deal more respect. In fact, the king has powers over the church, instead of the church having all the power over the king. In Protestant belief, clergy don't get special privileges. Maybe Henry should consider not relying so strongly on the power of the Pope, since Henry is such a great and mighty king. He might consider reworking the authority structure in England. Now, if you know Henry for his 6 wives or for a bad 70s song, but that's not what you need to remember Henry for. You need to remember Henry for his great matter, because under Anne Boleyn's advice, Henry decides to break away from the Catholic Church, that church that he wrote defending. Henry decides to break away from the authority of the Pope. Henry wants a divorce, not a divorce, I beg your pardon. He wants an annulment from Catherine of Aragon so desperately, he will do almost anything to get it. And so Henry separates the Church of England from the Catholic Church and puts himself in charge of the church. He gives himself an annulment from Catherine of Aragon and marries Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn becomes the Queen of England, and she delivers Henry's child, the child that caused so much trouble because Henry wanted to marry Anne before that child was born. Henry's son is a girl. Anne's baby is female. Her name is Elizabeth. Henry is livid. It's not the son he wanted. He split the Church of England apart from the Catholic Church, and Henry has a terrible problem now. Henry has Catherine of Aragon, his wife, to whom his marriage was annulled. Never happened. Then he has Anne Boleyn, his second wife. Both of them have daughters. There are no boys. The problem is, of course, that the Protestants followed the annulment of the marriage to Catherine, which means Henry was never married to Catherine, which means Catherine's daughter is illegitimate. She's not a legitimate child. The Catholics believe that Henry is still married to Catherine, and they do not acknowledge Anne Boleyn's daughter. Anne Boleyn's daughter is born out of wedlock. She's illegitimate. So we have 2 different daughters, each with a different group believing that they are legitimate. Henry continues on, since Anne cannot give him a son. Ultimately, Anne is executed for cheating on Henry, which she does not do. And Henry actually falls in love. He falls in love with a lady named Jane Seymour, who is a gentle peacemaker. Jane does present Henry with a son. Henry is delighted and he's madly in love with her. The problem is that Jane dies in complications from childbirth, and Henry loses the one love of his life. Henry's actually married to Jane, he's actually buried next to Jane Seymour. He then gets into an arranged marriage with Anne of Cleves, who is a daughter of a German Protestant wealthy merchant. Henry thinks she's hideous, and he actually starts divorce proceedings before the wedding. He calls her a Flemish mule or Flemish mare. Basically, he calls her a horse and says he wants nothing to do with her. He won't marry her. After he annuls the marriage with her, he gets involved with a 16-year-old named Catherine Howard. By this time, Henry is in his mid-40s. He has terrible gout. He's incredibly fat, but marrying a 16-year-old makes him feel like a real man. She's executed for cheating on him, and she really does. And finally, he marries an older lady named Catherine Parr, who is actually more of his nurse than she is his actual wife. In the end, one of the most important things Henry does is splitting the church away from the Catholic Church. And that split is founded on something called the Act of Supremacy, followed by a series of suppression acts. What's important for you to remember about the Act of Supremacy is that basically what it does is it puts the king above the power of the church. By doing that, Henry has the ultimate power in England. The next person down is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who answers to Henry. For the first time here in this class, since we started this class, the political power is stronger than the religious power. We are shifting from a world owned by, run by, and controlled by the church powers to a world where kings are starting to take a nationalistic, a patriotic viewpoint. Now, part of the advantage of the Act of Supremacy for Henry, beyond his annulment, is that Henry can then take away the privileges of the clergy. He closes convents and monasteries, claiming that they are abusing the people, that they are lying to the people, that they are basically ripping people off. And as he closes those convents and monasteries, he takes church lands and basically takes those lands that used to be administered by and taxed by the church and absorbs those taxes into his own coffers. Henry brings in a massive amount of revenue to England by closing all of these church lands. The problem is, and this is important, you need to remember this, it's going to come back to haunt us later. The problem is, those monasteries, those church groups took care of the poor, of the hungry, of the homeless. It was a moral obligation. It was a part of their religious belief to give money to the church or to know that the taxes they paid to the church were going to take care of the poor. People didn't resent the poor. They didn't feel like people were sponging because they felt it was a part of their religious and moral duty to take care of those people. God loves those people and we need to take care of them. As Henry splits the church away and takes away those lands, all of a sudden the poor become a burden. Because the poor, the government has to take care of the poor because the church can't. It's no longer a moral obligation. It's a social obligation. And the poor become a drain on the government. We're paying taxes and they're getting a free ride. There is a great deal of anger and resentment that begins here, and it's going to get worse. But it starts here with Henry's Act of Supremacy and his closing of the monasteries. There is deep-seated anger because the poor are now, quote-unquote, sponging off the hard-working, normal people. Now, last but not least, I want to show you how this shift from religious to secular, religious to political, influences art, and the easiest way for me to do that is by introducing you